So yeah, my talk is sort of then and now. So I was going to go, I had this great idea. Like, I'm going to talk about what it was to, like, hack stuff a long time ago. And then Cliff shows up. And I'm like, oh, well, this is going to be okay. Anyway, so, 2008, at 2008, who was doing some pen testing in 08 timeframe? Me, Ned. All right, very fantastic. Okay, good deal. 2008, in 2008, we had the Crackberries. Anybody remember these? Anybody addicted to their Crackberry back then? Their BlackBerry, get those top scores in a little brick breaker? Yeah, we had what do you call them? What are they even called now? iPods. Yeah, I had iPods, and they had edgy commercials for Apple. Netflix had DVDs. And our browsers looked like this, and people actually used IE back then. Now, I've seen some recent pen tests where I've seen this exact same version of IE. This was before we got all the lovely passwords from RockU. If you've done any sort of password cracking, we always use RockU as our sort of go-to. They were not yet breached. We didn't have that extra sort of information available to us. Lost was the biggest TV show on TV. Any Lost fans? Couple people? Yeah, I loved it till the last episode that I'm like, you wasted, hours and hours of my life. I now regret all things related to this. Thanks, Obama. President elected 2008 time frame. 2008, quite a while ago, we had things like Windows XP. I spent threes of seconds Googling their market share in 2008, and one website said it had 94% for the end user market. 94%. Right? We had these systems all over the place, and if you've ever done any sort of exploiting or attacking of Windows XP, we don't have any of the nice protections that we have built into Windows 7, Windows 10. There is no depth, so what we can do is we can write to the stack and we can execute. Like all the memory locations are not randomized. That memory is at a static location. I ran out of water. I hear Mark has good coffee. So. We didn't have safe SCH, safe linking, so we could take advantage of one of my favorite attacks ever is exploiting the exception handler. The exception handler's like, hey, something bad just happened, I got this. And you're like, I'll just put my code there. So exception handler's like, hey, I got this. Oh, you want shell? You got shell. Here's all the shells. And you guys take 660. Right? We use some of these techniques in more recent versions of Windows as well. All these memory protections are not there. We had LANman, right? We had LANman. How many of you have ever hacked a system or seen LANman hashes in the wild? Yeah, the good old, recently, yeah, I've still seen some recently on domain controllers. LANman hashes are terrible. It takes your password and converts it to uppercase, so all that fancy changing of case, bye-bye. Additionally, your password is now split into two 7-character chunks. So instead of having that complex 14-character password, now you have two 7-character passwords. And it is now trivially easy to crack and hit that almost the entirety of that key space. We also didn't at that time really have firewalls on our systems. I remember right about that time I was working at a university. And we had a professor pushing back on us. Like, I don't need a firewall on my host system because we have one on the network, and Microsoft recommends only one firewall. And now he was wrong, but it was a change, right? We had these systems wide open with all of these easy sort of things to exploit with super crackable hashes, which gives us this lovely recipe for hacking. Right? We take a dash of NBNS spoofing, add a touch of hashes. We've got these open systems, and we can get local admin. So the sort of path for least resistance in these days, what we would do is we'd show up on a network. And we show up on the network, and we would plug in. Now, Windows systems, they're lonely. One Windows system by itself is the saddest thing on earth. It's like, guys, Any of you know where my other servers are? What Windows will do is it's first going to look in the host file for the name. It'll ask DNS, but if it doesn't know it, it broadcasts out to everybody else. Now, my system on your network is the friendliest system there. You got questions, I got answers. You need files, I got files. You need web servers, I got web servers. You need web servers with authentication. Guess what? I'll happily take through your hashes. So we would set up this NBNS spoofing, get these password hashes. Because they were LM, because they were so easy to crack, we could crack them very, very, very quickly, spin it around, PS exact back to those systems, and it was like the easiest compromises ever. Now we still, don't get me wrong, NBNS spoofing is still super, super easy. It still happens, still very, very useful. I had one pen test, one of my first ones ever. I was on a flight. We had to travel back then. There was no such thing as a remote pen test. And on the flight, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to queue up my tools for the next morning, because I was showing up with a good friend of mine to the pen test, and we were going to race. We were going to race to the data or domain admin, I forget what it was, but we were going to race, so I got all my tools ready. And they show us into the organization, and they sit us down. And I've got my NBNS spoofer set up. I've got the command for John ready to run. I got PS exec and Metasploit ready to rock and roll. Sits us down, guys, he's like, I'll be right back. I'm going to go down the hallway and get coffee. Dude walks down to the end of the hallway, brings the coffee back. He's like, how you guys doing? I'm like, oh, we got domain admin. He's like, funny. I'm like, no, we do. And by the way, can I get some cream in there too? Maybe a little sugar? But these sort of vulnerabilities, now we sort of have moved past that, and we had at this time a lot of memory corruption bugs. MS 08, 067, that was music to my ears. Right, we see MS 08, 067 on these network, on one of these XP type system, Windows 2003, whatever. And it was trivially easy to exploit and get those system level permissions. Now, we still have a few of these, but it's much less common. We have much less opportunity for this. We have much better protections in our operating systems, like Windows 10. We still, though, of course, have our Eternal Blue and such. And our security back in those days was kind of crappy. But, of course, we did move forward. And as we move forward, we get new targets, some new actions, and of course we have new defenses associated with that as well. So sort of as we come forward to 2018, we've got IoT devices. We've got social media and mobile devices. The cool thing is with IoT devices, it's actually like hacking in 2008 or 1998. We get these brand new systems, and we look at them, and they're shiny. And it showed up at our house with Amazon Prime, like instantly answered by our doorbell for us. And this kernel is old. And they've turned off the memory protections. The web server runs as root. In Etsy password, we have the password is stored in Etsy password in this really fancy encryption. Base 64. I've seen this in a number of cameras. I had a camera. Bought it. A friend of mine did a blog post on how he did reverse engineering for this particular camera. I'm like, well, if he can do it, and there's this blog post, this is a hack by numbers. I'm going to follow through a hack by numbers, and I'm going to do the same thing. And I used binwalk, and we cut the files up, literally following through this dude's blog post. And then, first file you look at in Linux, Etsy password. There was the password. And there was an admin user and a viewer user, both of which was in the interface. And then there was a factory test account that was not in the web interface. And you could not change it. You didn't know it existed. So we get these advanced systems, if you will. But many times, we've sort of gone back in time. And we've seen some of this with mobile, too, where just because we can carry it around all of the time, we think it's sort of high-tech and super secure. And the vast majority of our apps are just a really, really crappy web browser. Right? We can't copy and paste. We can't do the same sort of things we would do in our normal browser. Of course, some of the biggest evolutions, the huge growth of a social media, Huge, huge growth of social media. And related to that, phishing. Now, I do some red teaming, pen testing, all sorts of offensive things. And these can be very useful for an offensive person, both the real bad guy as well as the good simulated bad guys. So we've got things like our YouTube, Skype, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. We can use stuff like that for DM phishing. So for example, if I send an email inside your organization, is that attachment probably going to make it through? If it's that EXE, probably not. Is that zip file going to be tagged as be careful, this came from an external source? Probably. Am I going to get all sorts of extra warnings? Be careful, this email came from the outside. Warning, this is not an internal email. Now when someone joins your organization because they're in LinkedIn and we send a message, we trust them. And there isn't this additional warning, hey, be careful, this is from the outside. No, I trust them because it came from LinkedIn. I love this name, Connect to an Opportunity. Boy, do I have opportunities for you. It works very, very well. And literally, people are incentivized to open these attachments. Think of HR. HR is getting attachments all the time. And they have to look at those attachments. They're called resumes. Salespeople. Salespeople are generously, financially motivated to open the attachments they receive. Right? Think of a loan officer at a bank. They get money by creating loans. As part of those loans, we're going to send them paperwork. I need to send them very sensitive information like, I don't know, my social security number, information about my payment information, where I live, my family. Now, one of the things I like to do is encrypt it before I send it to them. Right? We send that sort of nice encrypted email. And by encrypted, I mean they open the attachment, an Excel document. We tell them how to decrypt it. And the cool thing is, because they have this motivation, they will work over and over and over again to open that attachment. It's not like your normal end user, where I send it to them, it doesn't open, and they're like, oh, whatever. We can iterate. Hey, here's that Word doc for you. Oh, it didn't open? Here's a different one. Here's a different one. Let's try Excel. Hey, cool, PDF, right? So we can try all of these different sorts of ways for some of the DM phishing. I find this tremendously useful on the offensive side. Now, the follow-up question I get is, well, how do we protect this from a defensive side? I'm like, that's a different summit. Now, of course, the sort of the short answer is endpoint protection. But that's, of course, a battle. We have to fight some of those endpoint protection systems as an offensive group. We have to push those endpoint defensive products to be better and better. Some of the other huge changes that we've seen over the years. There's been a huge push to attacking Active Directory. What it used to be previously, we would land on a system and we would end up using these shared local administrative hashes and move from system to system to system. And now, the second we land on the network, it's like, let's go to Active Directory. Because we have built upon this for years and decades even, where we've used this technology, and it's perfectly fine technology, but you don't just remove it and start over. And once we start getting permissions problems inside this, we can use tools like Bloodhound to help us map our way through this. I was so excited when Bloodhound first came out. It was awesome. It was like, here's how to hack by numbers. And then I sort of felt bad. I'm like, I'm just following a script. I have literally been replaced by a shell script that I didn't write. Like, I go on sort of back to sort of script kiddie land. Now, related to that, if you're on the defensive side and you aren't trying some of these off-the-shelf tools to find these vulnerabilities, to find these issues before I show up or before the bad guys show up, you definitely should. And we can hopefully, ideally, remediate a number of these issues beforehand. You know what? I'm really thirsty. I'm having trouble with this chocolate milk. I hear you're good at opening the chocolate milk, Ed. Appreciate it. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Ed's been opening chocolate milk for speakers and children for years. That's all I am, is just a bunch of crappy jokes. All right. So we got things like Kerberos. Right, we've seen a lot of change related to our Active Directory and how Windows authentication takes place. Now, Kerberos, the old-timey, the mythology is there was a three-headed dog that guards the gates of Hades. Same thing in the Microsoft world. Right? It's the piece that is the gate protector, the gatekeeper, that either allows me into these systems or not. And we're seeing a lot of movement, a lot of research in this area. And there's a number of techniques that you should be doing in your offensive stuff, where I tell the domain controller, hey, I want to authenticate to this thing, and it gives me a ticket for it. And then we might be able to rewrite that ticket and generate some golden tickets, some silver tickets. Or we could roast those tickets, a Kerber roasting, where I request a whole bunch of tickets for systems all across my network. And now I can crack passwords for systems I don't have access to. Meaning they could be filtered, so I can't access it because of firewall. It means I don't have permissions to access them. It means the system could be offline, dead. It could be decommissioned. As long as that mapping is still there, I can get crackable password hashes. And it's tremendously useful. Now, we're not going to go into the full details of that, because I think I covered that a couple years ago here. But if you're doing some of the offensive stuff, we have to understand that the game has changed. We're not fighting the same defenders that we had so many years ago. These accounts, while protected, while firewalled off inside of our organization, are actually accessible to every single authenticated user inside the network. We've seen, of course, a number of exploits. Actually, not too many, but we've had one good Windows exploit since 2008. The Eternal Blue, Eternal Romance, Eternal Champion, Eternal Synergy. But it's becoming fewer and far between. So we've had to change some of our approach. I remember, how many of you, when you first started pen testing, thought you were going to be throwing memory corruption bugs around like crazy? No one wants to admit it. All right, fair enough. I did. I thought, I'm like, oh, there's going to be like Metasploit all over the place. I'm going to get so many EIPs. It's going to be fantastic. And then I found out, like, you know, we've actually moved in a slightly different method. And then some of the tools, unfortunately, these days, even if I can get one of these flaws, we've got problems with things like Meterpreter being caught more and more these times. The defensive products are tailoring their solutions against Metasploit, Cobalt Strike, PowerShell Empire. So we tried to move maybe things like PowerShell. Now, there's the big concern that PowerShell's time is up, because we've got constrained language mode. We've got ways to lock it down. We've got additional logging. And we're seeing that a lot of these off-the-shelf tools that we're unfortunately, it's becoming more difficult for us as the pen testers. Now, there's sort of an interesting discussion that we've had sometimes in the past. Should the defensive products stop us when we're trying to do our pen testing? Should it stop my Metasploit? Should it stop my PowerShell Empire? Should it stop my Cobalt Strike? Because what we're trying to do is we're trying to emulate a bad guy as efficiently as possible so that we can find vulnerabilities and we can move throughout the network. And if they're stopping us and the bad guy has a custom solution, they find us, but they might not find the bad guy. But then, of course, the counterpoint is, well, if I whitelist Metasploit, now every bad guy on the planet is now going to use Metasploit because it's whitelisted. Sort of a related tool. Have you guys ever used the real Windows PS exec on a pen test before? Matt and I. All right, great crowd. All right. So Matt, yeah. So if you use the real PS exec, it's a Microsoft sign tool from sysinternals, Mark Rusinovich. What this does is it allows me to remotely administer and remotely run commands from another system. It's tremendously useful as an admin. It's sort of like SSH for Windows, but without all the fancy crypto. But I can now run these commands on other systems. Now, we've seen the bad guys end up using this. So now what should our AV product do? Our defensive product. The good guys are barely using it. The bad guys are using it more than the good guys. Should we knock that tool off the list? Should we alert on that? And we'll actually see some products kind of flip back and forth. Like one day they'll block it, the next day they won't. And it sort of depends, in my personal opinion, on whether some big client came to him and said, you should block this one. Or, hey, we're using this, you should stop blocking it. So we're seeing a lot of issues with some of these off-the-shelf tools. We're moving a lot more to tailored C2. Now, this is a tremendous amount of work. Have any of you done any sort of tailored C2? I know Matt has. A couple of you, Joe. This is a tremendous amount of work. It's not like, hey, I'm just going to write a custom C2 for this client today, because that it can be weeks, months of work to set some of this up. And unfortunately, what happens is if we write this C2, now we're working on one at my company, but I can't go to a talk now and share it. Because now if I share this really cool thing that we did, I would love to share it. Now the defensive products can be like, yeah, we're gonna now kill this. And it's helped no one, and it's actually hurt us as well. So we see a lot of movement to people sort of writing their own or getting access to a system and custom compiling, C#. Matt's doing some really cool stuff with JavaScript on the endpoint. Because no one worries about JavaScript. They should, right? And worry about Matt, too, as well. We see things like veil evasion. How many of you guys use veil evasion? Yeah, we've seen some of the tools sort of move to catching some of that. I was just talking to John in the back. There's a tool from, it's called Hack the World. I forget the exact link. I just took their picture on GitHub. And it's really good at bypassing some of these detection mechanisms. And it's sort of a cat and mouse game. So Cylance detects it, and then they make changes, and now they're bypassed. And then it'll flip sort of a back and forth a little bit. But you might have to come up with some of your own sort of tweaks to make these things work. We used to use, back in the day, how many of you use Metasploit? Shikata Ganai. Shikata Ganai, right? What does that mean in Japanese? Nothing can be, Ed knows it. He's Japanese speaker. Yeah, nothing can be done about it. I remember when this came out, we were so excited. It's like it blew past every single AV product on the face of the planet. It was awesome. And then a couple of years later, apparently something could be done about it. And then we had tools like Unicorn and Dave Kennedy and TrustedSec that they've done to manipulate this. And Chris Trunzer with Veil Evasion, that's gone through multiple iterations. We've got some of this cat and mouse game. And our tools are not quite as long-lived at one point as what they were. So we have to do a lot more tailoring. Additionally, we're realizing some of our bad advice, like really bad advice. We used to give people terrible, terrible advice. So we had passwords, right? For the longest time, we told people, what do we need in passwords? We need uppercase, lowercase, and numbers. Right? We told people that this makes us more secure passwords. Additionally, now how many of you have an auditor in your organization? Your auditors, how often do you have to change your password? Every how many days? 90 days. You guys know why that exists? When Moses came down from the mountain, he had a third tablet. No, the reason is because in the 70s, it took 90 days to crack a password. Now, how many of you were not even alive in the 70s? Oh, gosh. Can you hand me my jacket, please? I need to put that. Wow, that's a bigger number than I thought. Yeah, in the 70s, it took like 90 days to crack a password. Now we got these GPUs with liquid cooling and stuff. We can do trillions with a T password attempts per second. We've got past the hash where I don't have to crack it. We've got Mimikatz where it's like, oh, I'll just get it in clear text. We have breaches where the same user uses their password in multiple websites. And all we have to do is just, follow Troy Hunt on Twitter and look at his have I been pwned, and we're like, oh, let's just get their password from somebody else. And we've pushed people to this 90-day thing, which means people have moved back to picking the simplest passwords. And NIST came out. The guy who wrote the original NIST documentation said, yeah, I screwed up. We sort of assumed that this would make us better, but end users, I've had users after I've done talks at conferences, I do some talks at non-technical conferences, where I speak it in more layman's terms. I had people come up to me and say, oh, no, Tim, I actually pick really good passwords. And they always look around like it's a secret. Like the Iranian spy is going to be standing right next to us, and if he looks, he's going to find him. Right? He's like, I use a password, but instead of an O, I use a 0. And I was like, oh, that's genius. Do you also? I look around too, because that's what we're supposed to do. Instead of an A, do you use an @ symbol? And they're like, and I'm like, well, what do you do for an L? And they're like, a 1. I was like, oh, man, my mind is blown. Right? And every attacker on the face of the earth knows that these are the substitutions that we make. And like, there's literally a language based on it. It's called leet speak. Right? Where we take our letters and we swap them out for something that looks similar. But our end users think that our passwords, of course, are more secure, and it actually adds trivial amount of real entropy, real randomness to this password, and it makes it much easier for us as attackers to compromise these. So it's just, it's Christmas with passwords these days. And of course, we've seen changes. We've seen the recommendation changes where we should, move to passwords that are passphrases. Don't require these crazy complexity requirements. Don't require this rotation, because what end users do. Any of you guys ever worked the help desk on January 2nd? Clearly 45% of you did, right? What's the phone call? I forgot my password. The rest of you that aren't laughing, you've made this call. Right? So, yeah, you make that phone call, I can't remember my password. I went home, we changed the password, and then they look outside, and there's snow on the ground. 90 days later, it's nice outside, and 90 days later, and they're like, hey, that's a great idea. I can look outside, and I can remember my password. So we've got, winter now, and next comes, I feel like more people should have answered that. All right, so yeah, after winter comes spring. Now, we got spring, next season, and ideally, the next year we have a spring, which means I can't use the password of spring. Also, I need a number. And end users sit there for probably 45 minutes to an hour to solve this problem of adding a number to their password that would differentiate this spring compared to the following spring. And of course, anybody that's done any sort of pen testing, any sort of password spray knows that password would then be spring 28. Well, next year would be 2019. But yeah, whatever. And so we've got to get our end users moved away from this. We have to push people towards password managers. And we've seen people say, well, now if I put it in a password manager, then I got this one place that's going to be compromised. A thing that we're really darn good at in security is throwing the baby and the bathwater out. If something doesn't solve the solution absolutely perfectly, we should get rid of the whole thing. And then we mock them for it. It's like, I can't believe that this end user can't remember every single password that they have to change every 90 days for the 3,000 accounts that they have. But realistically, that manager is going to make things better for them. We sort of mock those notebooks. Not the best, not the ideal solution, but now who's my threat actor? Someone has to be in my house at my desk. That's a whole different threat, right? Someone's in my house at my desk. There's other things they're probably going to be getting, right? I live in Texas. There's lots of other things that we would happily give them, if you will. But, we're really good at that, and we definitely need to move forward from that. And we've seen changes in the attacker space because of this. We've moved to things like two-factor. And as pen testers, as red teamers, I've seen people say, oh, well, it's got two-factor. Let's move on. Let's move on to the next attack. Let's not even bother with this because it's unhackable because it's got two-factor. Well, of course we've got tools that can do this. There's things like Evil Engine X. By the way, this is the creepiest picture I've ever seen in my entire life. I was trying to find these old-timey images, and I saw this. I didn't sleep for 3 days. Like, why is the Pope in the front with a... whatever. Anyway, so Evil Engine X. What we can do, I had a video, but I didn't have time for it, so I just grabbed some of the screenshots from their site. But what we can do is we can set up Evil Engine X as a proxy. So I'll set my site up, entice a user to sort of click on the link. They'll fill in the blank. This will capture the information, And additionally, it will grab the cookie. Now, I can use that cookie, send it to the end server, and now I can access that system as that other user. Because HTTP, any of you guys ever watched the movie 50 First Dates? The rest of you guys forget? Yeah, so Drew Barrymore wakes up every single day. She can't remember anything. Right? That's HTTP. And we send our request in, and the server's like, hey, nice to meet you. You haven't been here before. Thanks for coming. And you're like, yeah, I've been looking at cats for 4 hours. Here's my cookie. And it's like, oh, yeah, that's totally who you are. So now if I can steal someone's cookie after this authentication, we can now impersonate them on the website. Now, how can we convince them to go to our website? Typo squatting is fantastic. Right? Nobody reads anything anymore these days. You switch a couple of letters. In fact, Josh Wright and I, we were writing a class together, SANS 561, and we were talking about the typo squatting and how we picked a domain. And Josh said, hey, your legitimate list of addresses off to the left, I had legitimate ones off to the left, and on the right, I had the fake ones. He said, 2 of those match. And I'm like, no, they don't. He's like, yes, they do. I was like, nuh-uh. And I was like, he's like, hash it. He's like, how did you do that? I'm like, no, there's actually a typo. And it took him like 5 iterations to realize that tiny little mistake, because your brain will correct that. Like, I can't even process that in my brain right now. Right? Those really simple mistakes. And if you know what you could do, one of the things I find extremely effective, you ask the help desk, hey, I can't log in. Can you? Where are you trying to log in? Here's a link. Guess what the help desk does? Clicky, clicky, right? And then we end up with something like this, access to email. You want an effective phishing? Start phishing from the inside. No more banners for be careful with your external links. People are going to open up your attachments much more likely. Additionally, once you're inside, you can now send attachments to the help desk. You're like, hey, I can't open this. Because guess what troubleshooting step 1 is? Well, let me see if I can, right? Double click, and maybe we get shell as a privileged user. So the bad guys, the bad guys, they have adapted. They are moving forward. They are attacking our 2-factor. They understand the threat landscape. They understand the mistakes that the good guys are doing. And the bad guys, of course, always have hoodies, even back in the 50s. So as these tools, these techniques evolve, we need to evolve as well.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, sorry, we're going to have to move on. Let's thank Tim. Awesome job.